do something bold and courageous. Ideally in watercolor, we want to keep a fresh approach. And to me, that means having paint that does what you want it to do. And then we get the meditative quality of watching the paint move. I believe that this is actually one of the fastest ways to learn watercolor. Hi, I'm Angela Fair. I've been painting in watercolor for 30 years, and that means I've learned a few things. I know a few things about how to make watercolor work for you. Today I want to show you some ways that you can level up your watercolor almost overnight. Whether you're a beginner or you've been painting for a while, if you follow these little hacks for watercolor, you're going to see some rapid growth in your painting practice, more confidence, and more freedom to paint the way you were meant to paint. Let's take a look at some of these strategies. Paper is a big one, but we're not going to talk about that yet. I want to tell you about some of the brands that will help you paint better, but it's kind of also a boring topic. I'd rather talk about something a little more exciting, and that is color. So first of all, take a look at my palette. This does not qualify me as an expert. Anybody can buy a giant palette and fill it full of color. And there are a lot of artists who are going to tell you to work with a smaller quantity of colors rather than something this robust. And I concur with that. If you're starting out with a 64 well palette like I have here, you're going to feel overwhelmed. You're not going to know which color to choose. So we definitely want to start small. This is the accumulation of 30 years of watercolor. This is not where I came from. But I do want to point out that inside of my palette, I have these removable palette wells, and I want you to take a look at how big these are. This little palette cup can hold an entire tube of watercolor paint. Usually I don't fill it quite that full. I'll fill it maybe half full, but I have a lot of paint at my disposal. And that is one of the things I see artists failing to do when you first start painting. Often what I see instead is an artist will take, if you're working with tube paints, they'll choose their colors and they'll squeeze them into their palette in tiny little dabs, like something like this. And that is the amount of paint you want to use for your session. Now, I understand the draw to use fresh paint straight from the tube because paint, when it's squeezed into the palette, it will dry. This is that exact same color. And I've squeezed it into my palette several weeks ago, several months ago, and been using it regularly ever since. Between these two, I've got a larger quantity of paint here, but I actually use less paint when I'm working with it dry in my palette cup than when I'm squeezing it out fresh. Because when you're painting with fresh paint straight directly from the tube, I find that a lot of that paint ends up in my water containers. Let's just take a look. So I've moistened my brush. I'm going to grab some of this amount. I don't want to use it all because I just squeezed out a tiny bit and I might need some more later. This is how you might be thinking when you're painting. And so I want to now fill a space, and you can see I'm able to fill a few square inches. It gets a lot paler and more watery as I spread it across the page. This little dab doesn't go very far. If I were to grab the entire dab of paint, let's just scoop it all up onto my brush and start spreading it on the page. Well, first of all, it's thicker, it's drier. My brush isn't as watery in proportion to the paint I just picked up. So I'm actually kind of filling the same area as I filled here, but I'm getting a darker saturation of color, which is great. I now have the ability to paint pale colors and the ability to paint dark colors, and I've used up my entire button of paint. If I want this paint to go a little further, I can pick up some water and I can start to spread it out. And I might double my square inchage here. We can see now how far that little button of paint went. I haven't been able to work with it in full saturation, but I'm definitely getting some lovely, beautiful turquoise, one of my very favorite colors in watercolor. Now, if I go into this palette well, which has almost an entire tube squeezed out and used over time, first of all, I always prep my palette wells with a little spritz of water before I start, and generally not quite that much, actually. By moistening the top of my palette, I activate all of the dry paint on the surface of that squeezed out paint. So rather than having a button of completely fresh paint, I have firm paint with a surface that is moist. And I can then go in and just stroke up some color with no visible reduction in paint. So I'm taking a smaller amount of paint, but I want you to see what I can do with that quantity of paint. Do you see how far this is going? I haven't actually lost saturation at this point. So that, just stroking the surface of the paint, dried in my palette, gives me a lot more paint to work with. This matters because when you start painting, figuring out how much pigment to get onto your brush and to get those rich saturations of color is important. It makes a difference in your painting. If you're working with these more transparent washes and you want those to be darker, you're going to have to layer. And the more you layer your pigment, and continuing to just build up layers, letting it dry and then seeing that maybe it's still a little paler than you want and building up another layer, the paper texture of the paper starts to change as your brush scrubs across the top of it. So ideally in watercolor, we want to keep a fresh approach. And to me, that means having paint that does what you want it to do. And whatever the color in my palette is, when I've moistened the top of it, I've activated those colors. I'm then able to go in with a damp brush, stroke it until I get the quantity of pigment that I want to have, and then have that rich saturation. I can use a moist brush to dip in just very lightly and get a diluted quantity. All the while, I'm not losing as much pigment in my rinse water when I go to rinse my brush. And the paint goes further. It's faster to access with this little button of paint. Once I've run out, I have to drop everything, open up the tube, and squeeze a bit out again. Now, if you're working with paint that's come in pans and has already been set up for you into a palette as those little cubes of paint, I would encourage you at some point to try working with tube paint and just see the comparison of what you get in terms of your pigment load and how it performs for you. But a hack that you can use for your pre-filled pans of paint is to use your spray bottle and moisten your paint before you start painting. Get that surface of the paint activated. You're going to be able to access your pigment faster and get that darker saturation. And your paint is going to go further that way. Dollar for dollar, tubes of paint are a better value than pans of paint. If you look at the size of a tube, usually this one is, I believe, 15 milliliters, and the pans generally are going to be about a third of that. So what you're getting lasts longer and just gives you more value for the money long term. Color is my favorite thing about watercolor. We can do so many beautiful things with watercolor. So don't short yourself on color. Squeeze out a good quantity. Have it accessible so that you can dip into those beautiful candy-like colors that you fell in love with. They're the reason you're in watercolor to begin with. So let yourself embrace those rich, beautiful colors. Don't hoard them. Let them flow across the page. In fact, let's talk about flow for a minute. My little swatches here have been created with wet brush, dry paper, and a kind of juicy amount of pigment. So we have paint that stays where it was placed. And that's a great way to fill your paper or fill the shape in your painting. But when it comes to watercolor, one of the most wonderful characteristics of watercolor is the fact that it's made to flow. Just create a space where we can let some of that flow happen. If you're working with a lot of control, you're probably working with a pretty dry brush. You're probably working slowly to fill your space. You're probably clamping your fingers down at the ferrule of the brush. Those are all things we can address as you learn to be more free with watercolor. It's something I address in my online course, Watercolor Beginnings, on my site, heartledartist.com. But I want to show you just a little bit more. Fluidity, flow is one of the best things about watercolor. It's its best characteristic. I love watching color flow across the page. Flow is really such a gorgeous characteristic of watercolor. And, we can see that the paint will stay put when we're working with a drier brush, when we're working on dry paper. But when we introduce some water, and we can do that a couple of ways. I'm going to do it with my spray bottle here. Introducing water, we start to see flow happen. And I've got gravity on my side. I can tilt my little painting board here. And I want to watch that color move. Water is heavy. So as I tilt my board and introduce water, we're going to see some flow as that bead of water gets heavier. But it might take a little bit of work to get that bead going because we've got some surface tension as well. Water wants to follow the path of least resistance, so it wants to stay in the wet area. The only way it will really open up is if this bead of water gets so heavy that gravity pulls it downward, or if I use more water to open up that shape. And you can see how it follows the path I'm creating with my spray bottle. As it flows, the color starts to dilute. It's going to stop again. As that bead of water gets heavy, it'll open up and continue further. I can also wet the surface of my paper, and you'll often hear watercolorists talk about painting wet on wet. I'm a little bit different. I like to paint wet on dry and then add my water to open up these shapes because it gives me a little bit of control over the direction the paint flows. I have a lot more flow here because this area was wet first. And then we can drop in other colors and start to see some organic fluidity going on. So I'm going to try not to scrub my paint with my brush. I'm going to try to just drop it on the page. And I want to use moist color for that, color that has some fluidity to it. Just touch it into the paper. And then we're going to see what we can do about letting it kind of move organically on the wet page. And what happens then is this. We have orange and we have blue. I've chosen these deliberately because they're complementary to each other. We know that they are opposite each other on the color wheel. We know that if we mix these two colors, we're going to get a neutral, something a little bit muddier. But if we let them mix organically, using the fluidity of the paper, we don't just get some bland, muddy neutral. Let's see here. Some murky kind of grayish orange tone. And you can see that in my puddle here. Adding a little more of the orange makes it a warmer, muddy gray. Adding more of the blue is going to make it cooler. And they're not perfect complements, so there's even a hint of green in there. But it's pretty gray. But over here, we've got this kind of spectrum of neutral, which I think is really beautiful. We've got the blue, which is fairly pure here. We've got the blue mixing with the orange to give us kind of that neutral shade. And then it kind of transitions as it flows across the page. We see it transition from an orangier kind of muddy color to a cooler muddy color. And it just gives us so much nuance. And that's where watercolor gets to be just a wonderful friend to the artist, because we can really let that organic flow, the desire of watercolor to kind of blend with some natural beauty, create some much more fascinating neutrals than we could create on our own. I'm going to really encourage some fluidity here. And then we get the meditative quality of watching the paint move. I believe that this is actually one of the fastest ways to learn watercolor, is to work with a lot of fluidity and use your observation to notice how the paint moves, how the colors mix, how long it takes to dry in your area and your climate, and notice as well what you like. What do you get excited about? What are you intrigued by? What feels wrong even? What parts of this are not comfortable for you? And why would that be? So there's a real freedom in opening up your painting practice to observation, to curiosity, and just letting the paint do what it wants to do. Look at how interesting it is now as these two colors kind of flow down the page, creating this neutral path in between them. It's not really neutral because it's so active. There's so much going on here. And as I observe this, I start to think about strategies for future paintings where I can use maybe these two colors together to tell a story in my painting, to create something dynamic and beautiful. Working with fluidity regularly in your painting practice, even when you're a realistic painter, if you want photorealism, fluidity can be a friend. It can make some really beautiful moments happen in your painting, in your backgrounds, in your quiet spaces where maybe you don't want to paint a lot of detail, but you want something beautiful and interesting going on. There's some really beautiful nuance in these paler kind of diluted colors here. There's some lovely shifts of color going on, as well as in these strong dynamic areas. And so I believe that every painter should be making time for open-ended and very fluid watercolor play. It's going to teach you so much, and it's one of the easiest things to do. I want to share with you another hack for helping you grow as a watercolor artist more rapidly. And this one is going to be important if you've been trying to do this fluid wash strategy and it doesn't seem to be working for you. What you're getting seems a lot more flat, dead, muddy, just unalive. There could be a very good reason for that. It's one of the most important things I teach, and yet it's also the advice that's hardest for a new painter to take. So before we go to that hack, I want to share one more, and that is brush handling. If you're fairly new to watercolor, you might be really working to get precision in your brush strokes. And you're holding your brush just like you would a pencil, clamped down right around the ferrule, this metal part here, so that you can very carefully fill your space. And certainly this is going to give you much more control over your brush strokes. Notice that when I'm outlining here, this is a little extra tip, I follow the edge of my shape so that I can have more precision. If I'm trying to get in like this, it's a lot harder to navigate. Clamping down on the brush gives you that control, but it also kind of robs your brush strokes of life. So the beautiful kind of artistic brush strokes you're looking for are going to be found in a looser grip. If you can loosen your grip so that you can really move your brush with more of your arm than just tight locked wrist, you're going to have some more beautiful organic strokes. And that goes for whatever brush you're holding. This is a synthetic brush, so it's a little bit crisp in its strokes. It's a little bit kind of snappy, but I can use maybe a little more water. But if I'm holding the brush kind of toward the top of the handle, I get a looser stroke. I get something that's more fluid and organic. I can also vary the pressure, so I can get a wide stroke and then lift it to something thinner. And so that gives me just a lot more grace and natural feeling with my brush. Try it out on different types of brushes. Try it out on natural hair brushes. They're a lot softer, so you might get a kind of a squashier stroke. I'm not sure why I chose that color. Running out of room on the paper here. But the strokes we're going to get are a little bit softer around the edges even. And the brush just has a little more squish to it. And try it with flat brushes. Try it with large and small, but use that looser grip. You're going to see those more natural strokes. Finally, if you want to level up your watercolor, the number one thing that you can do to really grow more rapidly, to see a more consistent style, has to do with this plain white piece of paper. Level up your paper. If you elevate your paper, you will elevate your painting. There is a reason professional artists are emphatic about paper choice. We have seen the difference. We won't go back. What do I mean by elevating your paper? What makes good paper? This is where you have to be careful and you need to be wise, because paper manufacturers sometimes will try to trick you. They offer a lot of different types of paper, different brands, and different price points. And the paper's weaknesses aren't going to be advertised on the cover. So what do we look for? There's one thing that I look for over everything else when I'm purchasing paper, and that's this little phrase right here, 100% pure cotton. Cotton paper, for whatever reason, responds to fluidity, to water and watercolor in a much more responsive way than papers that are a cotton blend or made up of cellulose or some other fiber. I can't think of any exceptions to this rule. So I look for that on the paper, on the cover of a block or of the individual sheets. 100% cotton. See, I gotta look. I gotta read carefully. It's on here somewhere. 100% cotton. That's even a tiny logo. I think they should emblazon it large and big so that we know this is the most important quality. Texture of paper is going to affect how the paint responds as well. But at the end of the day, if you want your paint to move with fluidity and beauty, look for 100% cotton paper. These are watercolor blocks, which is actually the most expensive way to buy your watercolor paper. So if you are on a budget, look for individual sheets, the full-size 22 by 30 inch watercolor sheets. You can cut those down and tape them to a painting surface. These corrugated plastic boards are what I use. I just tape my paper down. I get to cut it to the size I want. And, you know, for my paper budget, I can do quite a few paintings on just one sheet of 22 by 30 inch paper. I know it's expensive. I know you're going to compare prices at the art supply store and struggle to justify the price of 100% cotton paper in comparison to the other stuff that's out there. But let me tell you, it makes a difference. It's going to make it easier for you to learn watercolor when you are working on a responsive paper. The only exception I would say to this rule is if you are a painter who wants to work with really fine precision, painting with a very dry brush, maybe in a botanical style where you have to paint with a lot of control and near photorealism. In that case, you're really not taking advantage of the fluidity of watercolor, creating those beautiful flows. So you can work on a cellulose blend paper. It's not going to impact your particular technique. But if you're wanting to paint with looseness and fluidity, and catch that vibrancy of expression, you need the 100% cotton paper. You're going to play on it and it's going to play right back. It's going to respond for you. And work on it all the time. Develop consistent techniques that you can count on because your paper is going to respond the same way every time. Sometimes people work with a cellulose blend and then want to use 100% cotton for their good paintings. The problem with that is if you're using cellulose blend for your practice paintings and then you're switching to 100% cotton for your, serious paintings, the issue you're going to have is you're going to need to change your working method based on how the paper responds. So it's actually making your job more difficult rather than easier. And so just working consistently on 100% cotton paper is a really powerful way to grow your technique. I have one more hack for you, one more fun way to grow as a watercolor artist. This is my favorite. I think it's the most valuable way to grow, and that is be bold. I've got this beautiful wash here, and I'm talking about boldness, and here's what I mean. When you're painting and you're learning to paint, you have a lot of questions in your mind. You're wondering, is what I'm doing any good at all? You're putting a brush stroke on the paper, and you're thinking, oh no, that just ruined everything. And so then you're going to want to panic and scrub it off the page. With this idea of boldness, I want to encourage you to be an artist who lets what you've done stand. When you put a mark on the page, rather than immediately panicking and dabbing it off, thinking of it as a mistake, let your brush strokes sit on the paper and then develop them. Develop your painting around whatever it is that you've just done. You can refine a stroke, find ways to, kind of develop it further. Maybe I can change a little bit of my shape here so that stroke doesn't feel so kind of abrasively zigzaggy. That's an artistic technique, right? Abrasively zigzaggy. But if you're learning how to place your marks, let them stay on the paper, maybe open them up a little bit, take some of the pressure off of you and let the painting kind of direct what happens next. Do something bold and courageous. And then rather than panicking and wondering if it was right or not, just assume that it was right and that you can continue working on this piece of paper with the changes you've just made. If you become an artist who kind of owns your process, who makes decisions in your painting, and then watches what happens as you add to those decisions and develop inside of those decisions, you're going to find so much confidence in yourself and your ability to make beauty out of whatever you've put on the page. You're going to develop a trust in the medium because it actually wants to be beautiful. It wants to create little watercolor moments that you will lose if you're scrubbing your painting in a panic every time you put a brush stroke down. I learned this the hard way. I was an indecisive painter. I dabbed off more strokes than I placed on the paper in those early years of painting. And one of the most freeing things for me has been giving myself an assignment. Not every painting necessarily. I do sometimes lift out in brush strokes, but I will often place something bold on the page and challenge myself that for this painting, I am not going to undo anything I've done. I can refine it. I can, spread the color around a little bit. I can develop over top of it. I can try to even camouflage it. But I let my marks stand. I let those decisions live on the page. And there is true freedom and confidence in allowing that to be a part of your process. And when that becomes a part of your process, you become unstoppable as an artist because you know how to take what's in front of you and just dance with it. And even when you go too far, you do too much, you're too bold, you're too whatever, the strategies you use here are going to be strategies that you're adding to your toolkit that you can use with intentionality and with confidence in your future paintings. And that is one of the very best things about this idea of not second guessing yourself. Let those brush marks live and see how you become more adaptable as a painter and just much more powerful as an artist. Whether you're a beginner artist or you've been painting for a few years, your art practice gets to be your art practice. It should reflect who you are, and you should feel freedom to paint the way you want to paint. There's a lot of shoulds and have-tos in art that don't need to be there, and you get to decide what rules to follow and what rules to break. And breaking rules can be the most fun part of this process. As you try out these different hacks for your watercolor practice, notice what makes you come alive. What things do you need to add to your art practice that remind you to paint with more freedom? What things do you need to let go of? How can you paint today to make this process really, really enjoyable? And how can you trust that those enjoyable parts of today's practice are going to inform the paintings you make in the future? Your skills are growing every time you pick up the paintbrush, and so there's nothing stopping you from making your art practice more fun today so that you'll be a better artist tomorrow. I'm Angela Fair. If my way of teaching beginner watercolor with some playful techniques to help you be a looser painter, if these have helped you, I want to encourage you to check out my online classes. I have a class just for beginners called Watercolor Beginnings on my website, heartledartist.com. And if you're a little more intermediate in level and you want to really embrace your own personal style and create a heart prioritizing artistic practice that lets you be who you are, I have classes for that too. Check out my Heart-Led Artist Journey, Heart-Led Pathways, or my Back to the Brush course to help you get going right where you are today. Thanks for watching.